Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friends, Dr. Philip Chase.
Hello, AP. How are you?
I am doing very well. And how are you today?
I am doing just wonderfully. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me on. And I am in such great company today. I'm thrilled.
Well, and that's the big point of this video, because our conversation, our discussion is going to be elevated by the fact that we are joined by Ruthan, the High Fist himself.
Thank you, AP. As always, it's an honor being here with you guys. Is my version of a Super Bowl or a WrestleMania or whatever. So it's always showtime for me when I'm here with you guys.
We see, this is the thing. Ruthan brings the big guns, both the literal big guns as well as the intellectual big guns. Like we're outmatched and outclassed here, Philip. It is an absolute pleasure that the two of you are with me, because we're going to be discussing Cracked Pot Trail, one of the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach novellas. And before we get started, it's no longer considered spoiler territory. Yes, one of the characters in the novella may bear some slight, tiny resemblance to me. So why don't we start? This is going to be awful, isn't it?
It's the snarky homunculus.
AP is in the book. It's not that there's a character who's slightly base, blah, blah, blah. AP is actually in this story.
Apto Canavalian, the snarky homunculus.
Oh God. So before we get started on a sort of spoiler discussion of everything that happens in the novella, do either of you have any sort of general points, non-spoiler discussion points to frame this for the viewers?
Yeah, I'll let Ruthan, why don't you go first?
So I would say that this is probably the richest in terms of a literary flavor. We won't get into the spoilers and the characters and all that, but I have a feeling that this is one of those stories that was written for guys like you, right? People who sort of really have a deep understanding of prose and the history of fiction and the different homages that are at play here. Even though most of Erikson's works are like that, and even though even the Bauchelain stories in many ways are like that as well, I feel like this is the most analyzable out of the Bauchelain books. This is the Bauchelain story that you turn up with for some kind of literary conference, for a presentation or whatever, because there's just so, even by Erikson standards, there's a lot to unpack here. And even by Erikson standards, even though I sort of might not even get most of those references, just by reading the book, the story, while I was reading the story, I was always like, wow, this is meant for this. This is not really something that I'm even meant to see. This is something for people who really wish to sink their teeth into a lot of meaningful prose, where every line and every character and every shade has some kind of deeper meaning and story behind it. I don't mean that in a facetious way. What I mean, it does sound a bit facetious, I guess. But what I mean is that this is the most what do I say? Yeah, the heaviest, the deepest out of the Bauchelain books. It's less Ruthan bad and more, I don't know, Philip Chase, I guess, if that makes sense.
Well, I guess that's the good segue to me. So I would say that there's some really entertaining, wonderful humor in here as well, but there's a lot of meta stuff going on in Crackpot Trail. It's a lot of, I think, AP, when you and I were talking with Steven Erikson fairly recently, he described this as the most meta thing he'd ever written. So, and it is, you mentioned the homages. For me, as a medievalist, my mind leaps to Canterbury Tales, which is very much a meta narrative as well. Canterbury Tales has a frame narrative, so does Crackpot Trail. There are stories within the story being told by the various pilgrims along the way. Obviously, the same is in Crackpot Trail. So you have there are different things. There are differences too. So you have, as many people have heard this described, as Canterbury Tales meets the Donner Party. But also, I think before we started recording, Ruthan, you had mentioned 1001 Nights, and I think that's also a very important comparison as well. The idea of telling stories to stay alive is a big thing there too. So yeah, and other meta narratives too, like Boccaccio's Decameron, for example. But Canterbury Tales is the one that I think of, because Chaucer was, I think, very much like Steven Erikson. Actually, there's some interesting similarities. I hope he doesn't mind if I say this, but there are some interesting similarities between the two, I think, as authors, because they're both very, it seems to me, is particularly in this story, in Crackpot Trail, you do see Steven Erikson pondering the role of artists and writers and that sort of thing within society, and the relationship between the writer and the audience. And also you got to throw the critics in there as well, literally throw them in there. So especially a particularly beloved critic. So you've got all this really a lot of really interesting stuff, I think, about society and about art and its role and the relationship between artists and the audience and all this stuff. But you also have a very entertaining and in some ways comically suspenseful story going on. So it was a lot of fun, and there's a lot of interesting commentary. And when you realize what he's doing there, it becomes more interesting to me. So I guess that would be my very broad, non-spoiler introduction to it.
Yeah, and chronologically, it follows on from the Wurms of Blearmouth. So it is continuing that Korbal Broach and Bauchelain through line of their adventures, misadventures. How are we describing their travels across the Malazan
experiments?
Yeah.
So now that we've done that, why don't we're going to launch into full spoiler discussion. So for anyone who hasn't read it, of all of Erikson's books, there are probably only two books that I would say that to go into without knowing the end is actually important. And it's only two. One is the last book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Crippled God. I think the ending of that is so important that it should never be spoiled. The other is this book. So if you haven't read it, while it will drive my viewing figures into the ground, please don't watch this spoiler section, because things are going to get discussed here which completely change your reading experience. And I really think it is one of those books that you should read with knowing as little about it as possible, apart from these very general comments we've made. So full spoilers from here on out. Thank you for watching if you've stuck around this far. And now, spoiler talk. Do you want to get this out of the way?
I just want to talk about it the whole time, actually.
So let me just give out my 2 cents for the Bauchelain fans out there, because usually people read these works because they're Steven Erikson fans. They're not Bauchelain fans. They're Steven Erikson fans. The actual Bauchelain fandom, as I've learned the hard way, I have a channel and I've been trying to promote it, but I still don't have any takers. The actual Bauchelain fan base is quite niche. And I think the hardcore Bauchelain fan base does not tend to like the story, because we have no Bauchelain and Korbal Broach here other than the last couple of pages. And I mean, Korbal Broach doesn't even appear. He's just mentioned. And there's just a small conversation between Bauchelain and Emancipo Rees. But with that being said, once you can set that aside, once you get past that, there is a lot to unpack here, because the reason many of us were disappointed was because we were so sure that there would be some reveal at the end that this was Bauchelain's plan all along, that there was going to be some cool plot twist in the end, which tells us that Bauchelain at either Mr. Musk turns out to be Rees, and he's always with that pipe. And whenever I saw Mr. Musk with that pipe, I was like, that's my boy Reese. I know it. And the carriage, there's a scene where they sort of the carriage window quickly opens in and they give it out and they close it back, and everyone else is like, wow, it must be really hot in there. And there are mentions that the lady in the carriage uses sorcery. I was just waiting for that awesome reveal where it was Bauchelain all along and it was Reese all along, and it just never really happens. And as I was telling you guys before we started recording, a lot of people, when they find out that I'm a Bauchelain fan, a lot of Malazan fans, they're like, oh yeah, man, oh, Crackpot Trail, I love Crackpot Trail, that was awesome. And I just want to smack them across the face, because you're not a Bauchelain fan if Crackpot Trail is the first Bauchelain story that you go to. However, since I am a Steven Erikson fan as well, I get why Steven Erikson fans have this as their go-to Bauchelain story. So I have a lot of good stuff to say about it. And as AP was saying, I just want to get that out of the way, because if this had been one of the Bauchelain stories on Facebook, I don't think anybody would have had a problem, because that's just for free. You just go click on Facebook and you read. But here the publisher's like, yeah, give me your American dollars. And once they take your American dollars, they're like, fuck you, there's no Bauchelain and Korbal Broach here. So that's the only bit.
Now that you have that off your chest, and he did tease you a little bit in there too by having the 2 meals brought in instead of one, and
teased. He had me by the balls. I mean, it's not just teasing. My God.
He had the chamber pot, which everyone was amazed how much is in that thing, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah.
But this is for a story that is so much about storytelling, the meta aspects of what storytelling is. I thought that this was so well done, because you have this concept of negative space. Bauchelain and Korbal Broach and Emancipar Rees are present in this story on every page, because the reader is putting them on the page. That when you look at that text, those symbols go up through your eyes into the back of your head, and you create the meaning. Yeah. And you interpret must as Emancipar Rees, that the damn talk is Bauchelain hiding in there, that carriage is their carriage. They are present the entire time because you put them there, not Erikson. Erikson didn't write them into the scenes. We did. We put them in the scenes ourselves when we read. And I think this is an amazing experiment in literature that proves this point, that we create the meaning for stories, we create these scenes, and it does not always connect to what is actually on the page. Right. And it is a wonderful way of expressing this. And I think this is some of the cleverest writing and that sort of technical way of playing with story that Erikson has done.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I can understand why when people read that and they get to the reveal at the end and go, oh, it wasn't them. I thought it, but what? I don't get it. And very, very briefly, one of the earliest reviews of this book spoiled that ending in the review.
Oh dear.
Because they didn't like the book, and they said this is not a Bauchelain and Korbal Broach book because they are not in it.
Ruthan Bad, did you write that review?
Well, I'm cheap, Philip, but not that cheap.
And I couldn't understand why anyone would do that, because when I first read it, part of the fun was that's them, they're hiding in the carriage, that's them, they're hiding. And reading it the second time, the third time, knowing that they aren't there, it is a completely different story. And I don't know why anyone would ruin that for someone, to ruin that experience. Okay, maybe it didn't work for you, but that's like reading a mystery. It's like watching an M. Night Shyamalan. How do you pronounce his surname?
Shyamalan. M. Night Shyamalan. Yeah.
M. Night Shyamalan. Watching one of his films and giving away the ending in your review, or watching Murder on the Orient Express and giving away the ending, reading one of the murder mysteries where you're trying to work out who done it and giving away the ending in a review. Yeah. No one would do that. And yet this early review, and this was before, I think it was an advance copy had gone to this guy, and he revealed it in this early release review before the book was released. And I just thought that I was not impressed by that coming from a review.
Tacky. But I'm really interested in what you said earlier, AP, about a story actually being something that takes place in here, within the reader's mind, as the storyteller, as you're either reading it or hearing the story. The story isn't what's, the words printed in here. This is just ink on paper, or the air that is pushed out of my lungs as I manipulate it with my, voice box and my tongue and my teeth, and it hits the air and it vibrates in your eardrum and all that. And it's what happens in here. And that's one of the interesting things that happens. And that is what Avis Didion Flicker takes advantage of as he tells his stories within here. So he is okay. So if Apto Canavalian is the famous critic, is Avis Didion Flicker then a stand-in for Steven Erikson in some ways?
Without the wives.
Yeah, with all the wives. So perhaps in some ways we could say that, but it's really interesting how he is so aware of how the story happens in here within his audience, both us and the other characters in the story, hearing him tell his stories, both of them, which are meant to manipulate them. And he is the assassin with words. He is the one who gets people to do what he wants through his words by them filling in the gaps and knowing what the tropes are, knowing what, how we fill in the gaps in stories and playing with that. It's absolutely brilliant stuff how he does that in there. So his whole narrator within, but narrator without, both looking within and looking out at us. It's just really cool stuff.
Yeah.
And he keeps warning us. A Flicker keeps telling us, look, there's a deceit here, but it's not the one you think. There is something tricky going on here, but it's not what you're thinking. And as I was reading it for the third or fourth time, I was like, it's so, I mean, which is why the revelation that some reviewer spoiled it, that's a Fangatooth version of a reviewer. That's a Caros Invictad version of a reviewer to Erikson's Tehol. Because when you go back again, as I was telling you guys, I wasn't happy with the way that it shaped out. But when I went back and I saw that Flicker kept telling me that there was deception here, but it's not the one that I was thinking of, that once again elevated the story to me.
Yeah, and there are one of the things that people keep saying about, say, like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. The reread experience is so different because of what is revealed at the end of The Crippled God. And I would say this is one of those books that when you reread it, and this is why when we see those films that have the twist ending, that quite often in a film, they'll show you that sequence of flashbacks, of memories, of earlier scenes, that now when you have the context, now when you know what the end is, these scenes take on completely different meanings, and you're actually getting two different stories. And it's because, and it's part of reader response theory, and there's a whole load of critical theories all about this, but we give meaning to the story in our own brains. And as our context changes, that changes the meaning of what we're interpreting. And it's one of the reasons why this is my absolute favorite of the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach novellas. It has nothing to do with the specific character, but it's because this works on so many different levels for me. And I know I've talked a bit before about the idea of the diegesis and having diegetic levels. And if you think there's a frame narrative that establishes that, Flicker is telling this story at a certain point, and then you have what you would sort of consider the diegetic level, the main diegetic level within this frame narrative. There are different ways you can construct this, but this is the easiest way. And then within that, there's another story being told, so a hypodiegetic level. but the entire thing functions with a self-awareness of the textual reality. So it's a metatextual text that has these breakdowns in the diegesis, because at times the character of Flicker is basically talking to the reader. The narrator, Flicker, is talking to the reader. And there's this manipulation of these different narrative levels, backwards and forwards, up and down through different layers of meaning and understanding, that it makes it, in all honesty, an enormously complex narrative to deconstruct. It is fascinating what is going on. And then when you add in the homages to the stuff going on with a sort of almost recreation of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and how that is being subverted, inverted, and played with. And then when you add in the concept of the Donner Party, basically being, these are artists, instead of singing for their supper, singing not to be supper, and playing with that. And then the commentary, the meta commentary on the relationship between artist, fan, and critic in this triangle, that they all feed off one another. They are all connected. And what they are all getting out of the product, this narrative, is completely different depending on the perspective. And all of this is played with in a narrative that is still a story that you can read, that still has entertaining things happen, that still has humor in it, that has violence in it, that has fun things happen, that fits seamlessly into the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach timeline. It makes perfect sense. It continues the story. It has that same element of absurdist humor, as well as some of the horror. All of this is worked in, and you go, when this one tiny little book is doing all of those things, that sometimes you have to take a step back and just go, holy shit, can Erikson bloody write?
Yeah, I would add one more thing to all of those things that you mentioned, which I completely agree with. And that is, there is something, as much as there is all of this absurdity and grotesquerie going on in this story, there is also something beautiful at the heart of it, which is, I guess it's more of a question than an answer here, but can storytelling be redemptive? And I think that's a really interesting thing that he puts in here. And I mean specifically with the story that Avis Didion Flicker is telling for Purse Snippet, and the idea that he can somehow help her, I suppose, in a way, make sense of her life, give her a narrative. That is what he's doing in a way. Yes, he's saving his own neck by telling the story in a certain way, but there's a question here as he's telling the story. Can storytelling be redemptive? Because that's his task. Basically, she's to decide if he fails in this task, he's done, he's over with, because he has given her the power over his life, to judge if he has failed in his task of redeeming, in a sense, her. Then he's done. So I think it's a wonderful thing that he puts in here with this character, Purse Snippet, and she's a fascinating character too. And I think as somebody who just who makes a living from stories, essentially, that's what I do. And that's, we all thrive on storytelling. I would like to think that storytelling is redemptive, that we need it, in fact, in order to give us narratives that help us wrestle with this crazy chaos that is all around us. So I don't know. I mean, what do you guys think about that idea of storytelling being possibly redemptive?
I mean, on that point, I would say that more than the Purse Snippet one, what he does for Relish Chanter, I thought was a lot more tangible. He frees her from the clutches of her brothers in that sense. But overall, I mean, you guys know me. I always prefer the cynical take on it. To me, it was. I mean, were you going to say something, AP?
Well, no. I wait for you to finish your point, because I think it's going to be very similar to mine.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, this to me was a take on sort of the whole harrowing survivor's tale story, where we hear a lot of these nightmarish stories in the real world about people stranded on an island, on a boat, on a jungle somewhere, in a desert somewhere, and they have to resort to cannibalism. And here it's like they don't really have to resort to cannibalism, but they choose, they kind of choose to anyway, because the people in power decide. And I would say, and as a reader of the 10 big books, I would say, contrast this, and this was what kept going through my mind when I was reading this. Contrast this with the journey through the glass desert in Dust of Dreams and the Cripple God, where the Crackpot Trail and the glass desert are very similar settings, where it's just complete depravity, and you have this group traveling through it with no food or water. Those children, the snake, traveling through the glass desert, they make it through just based on friendship and hope and sort of inner strength and willpower and all that. Those kids make it through. And here we have a bunch of adults who sort of it's a complete subversion of that, because that is this journey through a desert where it's all about holding on to your humanity no matter how desperate things get. And this story is all about people saying, who cares about our humanity? I need my horse. And there's even a great passage in the story where it's like Talgott Weiss or whatever brings up the idea of midday meals. He's like, he's not just happy with having dinner. He wants to have midday meals as well. So they now need to start killing more people. So to me, that contrast between the harrowing desert story where people resort to cannibalism and this one here where they just do it because they like eating food and the chanters find it fun. To me, that was the crux of the humor in the story.
And just to build on that, if you think you isolate that point, the journey across the glass desert is all about what do you have to do to survive. And once you've gotten survival, yes, it's deprivation, yes, it is not pleasant, but you can do terrible things in order to survive. But what we have in Crackpot Trail is people doing terrible things because they don't want to be inconvenienced. It's not about survival, it's about convenience. And the fact that it's in this book makes me think a lot about what happened like during the pandemic. Like 1918, when the Spanish flu it was what people were going, what do we need to do to survive this? How can we sort of band together and fight this? And here we have a very similar pandemic is still sweeping the world, and people are like, yeah, but I want to go out for lunch with my friends. Like, when are we opening up restaurants? You go, but that means that people have to work in the restaurant and then they could get sick and die. Yeah, but I really like eating in restaurants. And it's bizarre how the world continually seems to keep coming back to this, that when times are incredibly tough, we band together, we do what we need to survive, and we support each other. But when times are slightly inconvenient, we can do horrendous things to each other because we just don't want to be inconvenienced. But the point that I was going to make to build on Philip's was, I think that the positive aspect of what stories can do, what language can do, that is something we aspire to. But quite frequently, what we are far more familiar with is the damage that stories can do and language can do. Propaganda and the misrepresentation of something, the narrativizing of events and facts into a story form to sell to the public, to manipulate the public, to manipulate all of us. We see this time and time again, from the Nazi propaganda machine of World War II. That is probably the most famous example. That is not the only example, but it's the one that everyone knows about Goebbels and the films and the propaganda films. And everyone thinks, oh yeah, it was very obvious. And you go, no, this is what happens with newspaper stories. When we talk about newspapers or news channels being left-leaning or right-leaning, what they are doing is they are taking a factual situation. The president of whatever country steps off their plane, and that will be reported of the proud arrival of, for someone who is pro that president, or, oh look, apology tour, next stop, on someone who is anti the president. It's exactly the same fact, but we narrativize it. And what we've seen is this polarization of political ideals, of ideologies, of tribalism now being applied, and this propaganda, this narrativization of what is going on in the world has become so prevalent. And this is what we see here. We see Flicker manipulate facts, manipulate the perception of reality to create a narrative that will sway and manipulate people. Can this be used for good? I think so many authors write texts hoping that people will take the good meaning from them. And yet so often they are disappointed, because the texts that prove most powerful are the ones that encourage our fears, that prey on our fears, that are manipulating us into anger and outrage instead of inspiring us. And I think that is one of the things that is being played with in this story. So sorry to be like all serious when this is in fact a very funny story.
Yeah.
But I think that's what we see here. We see a commentary on propaganda. We see a commentary on how a factual reality that we can see on the page can be manipulated by how it is being relayed to an audience. Yeah. And to see it illustrated so starkly, you think that after reading this book, the next time you sit down to watch a news broadcast, you start paying attention to the synonyms, you start paying attention to the context of things, you start paying attention to the specific words that they are using to narrativize an event, to give you a particular perspective on it.
Right. I agree with everything you just said. And there is, I think, a good deal of cynicism in the interactions between Avis, Diddy, and Flicker and the entire crew that's with him, except there is, I think, a tonal difference in his interactions with Purse Snippet. There is a difference there that I find intriguing, that there seems to be, she seems to understand, there are clues, plenty of them, that she understands what he's doing at many moments, that she understands the manipulation that's going on, and she's kind of willing to play along with it to see where it goes. There's even, I think, a tonal difference between the two sex scenes in the story. There's the one which is really quite a romp there with Relish. And then there's the much more, I think, I don't even know how to describe it, but it is a more serious moment in a way, even though it's certainly idealized. Okay, so the movements that Purse Snippet commits during this particular interaction are very graceful and dance-like, and she is a dancer and all that, and so it's hyperbolic even. But at the same time, that scene with Purse is still somehow, there's an intimacy and an honesty there that I find very interesting. And so I just thought that whole thing it's really, it's not the majority of Crackpot Trail. The majority is all the stuff you were talking about with the comedy and everything else. But I do like that we have this more honest and perhaps serious relationship that exists between Flicker and Purse Snippet, which for me, I guess that's sort of a private favorite thing, is the idea of stories in some way being redemptive, the idea that we can make sense of all of this in some way, at least in a way that we know it's a lie, we know it's a narrative, we know we've imposed some kind of structure onto something that doesn't really have it, but it enables us in the moment to wrestle with it and to feel, I think, in some way that we've had a cathartic experience that is healthy and good. So I don't know, but we still have to talk about this Apto Canavalian character here.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, I mean, let me just add one quick thing to that. So the funniest thing about that sex scene for me is that all these years later, Flicker still remembers that she sent him to bed with blue balls, and that's what he remembers. That day he's like, I still remember that night where I sort of got no action. In terms of, yes, Apto, I mean, I've been looking forward to the discussion for that, especially because to me, number one, is already a sort of very interesting character in terms of the interaction between the critic and the artist. When you find out that it's based on AP, it goes to a completely new level, because when I was reading it again, because Apto, number one, is like, I mean, I have this habit where I interrupt people all the time, and Apto just loves interrupting people, especially when people are in a flow, right? And uh, he always like, but how does this work? But how does that work? How did this happen? It shouldn't be that way, because a lot of people interfere, right? A lot of people in Crackpot Trail interfere when people narrate their tales, but Apto always has a certain, you don't even need to know that it's Apto, and his name doesn't need to be mentioned, and you know that it's him. You know that it's his voice. The relationship he has with what's his name, Brash Polster, or whatever.
Buster,
exactly, yeah. The young one. And there are he keeps saying, look, it's never you. Why is it always us? Why does it always have to be us who are sort of the first sacrificial goats? Why can't it be you guys for a change? And to be honest, I suppose if you're an artist, it's completely legitimate for you to feel that way. And just imagine, number one, it's such a great, for me, metaphor of film critics and literary critics and blah blah blah, where these people, I mean, you might not even know the basics of holding a camera, but because you're a critic, you can sort of insult the latest Martin Scorsese movie, right? You might not even know how to write a fucking sentence, but because you're a quote unquote critic, you can be like, oh, Erikson doesn't know how to write women. Erikson doesn't know how to do this, blah blah blah. You might not know anything about anything, and yet when you have this label of critic, you can essentially get away with whatever you want. And there's some of this with the painter and the talking frog in the 10 big books, where we get some kind of pot shots at criticism and all that, but here it's so crystallized. I mean, the sort of the empty, shallow, insecure sort of a flea-ridden personality and life of a critic is just brought to full glory by Steven Erikson through the Apto character. I just love that.
That's brilliant stuff. And I have to say, I have to confess that I have had the unique privilege, well, not unique, but I've had the privilege of being a brash fluster. I have had, AP has looked at my own writing at one point, and it's so eerie and uncanny how Steven Erikson has captured the voice of the of the critic in Crackpot Trail. Just the totally deflating. He can deflate your ego in one cute little sentence, pointing out some, in retrospect, it looks like so obvious once he says it, but it's like, oh, you think it works this way, and you're like, oh, wait, I guess I got that wrong. So poor Brash Fluster, I felt for him.
And the rest of them take it for granted as well, that he's not going to be one of those who's the sort of who's going to be sacrificed. And Brash never gets it, and I never got it as well. And that was what made it so funny and infuriating, that all these non-artistic people like the Knights and all that, they too fall into this illusion. They too fall into this sort of this trap of assuming that we get even Tiny. Even Tiny is like, oh, when we're done with them, then we come for him. And Brash is like, why do we need to wait for that? Right? It makes no sense. And even in the public eye, sometimes we are so uncritical of critics. And this story was a great shining example of that. I can't stop talking about it.
But it's also interesting, the interactions between Apto Canavalian and Flicker, because that's they're obviously artist and critic, but there seem to be some interesting little winks going on between these two. And there seem to be moments of understanding between these two that I find kind of fascinating as well. So there is a parasitical relationship going on here as well, isn't there? Because as much as the artists, as the writers, might resent the critics, they need them too. That's the secret. That's the dirty secret, right? They actually are dependent on them. So you could call it a symbiotic relationship, or you could just call it parasitical, or whatever you want. But there it is. So there is a symbiosis between the two that you see in the interactions between Avis, Didion Flicker, and Apto Canavalian. Would you agree with that, AP?
Well, let's look at this through a couple of different stages. So obviously there is this relationship where the critic is judging the art and pointing out flaws and being slightly supercilious and going, but that doesn't make sense, and where's that thing, and justify yourself for this.
Yep.
And that is an element of it. But where is the critic going? The critic is going to this festival where it's going to be judging the artist of the artist of the century?
Yeah.
That
every year.
That they hold every year. And is he having his way paid?
Oh no.
So there are multiple levels to this. One is, yes, obviously the critic is being venerated because the critic is going to decide who the artist of the century is this year. But at the same time, society doesn't actually value the critic enough to go, yeah, well, we'll pay for your transport.
Yeah.
That the critic is not valued. When we see the critic make observations about the various stories and the various texts, is there a difference between the questions the critic asks and the questions the general audience ask?
Like Tiny.
Is Tiny just as good a critic as Apto?
He thinks he is.
And again, it goes into, well, what is a critic doing that the general audience isn't doing? So again, the critic's role is not necessary, because all that is necessary is the artist, the author, the story they create, and the audience. A critic is unnecessary to that relationship. But at the same time, we do see a growing respect between both Apto for Flickr and Flickr for Apto, because Apto realizes that Flickr is not the same as the others, that there is an intelligence and a dexterity and an intellect at work in this narrative that he is spinning, and goes, actually, this is one that I'm impressed by. Whereas obviously Erikson had so much fun writing the absolutely terrible utterances coming out of Nifty Gum and Brash Fluster. Like we have to talk about the story, the poem of Kalam trying to assassinate Lacine, but there's a respect that the critic has for Flickr, because Flickr is a great artist. Flickr is someone who is impressive, and the general audience can't seem to differentiate between the good stories and the ones that are terrible, because they laugh at the terrible ones and they think they're hilarious and, oh yeah, that was great, I am entertained. But the critic actually appreciates the complexity and the technicality of all the stuff that Flickr is doing. Flickr then gets an audience that actually understands his work, the effort he is putting in, the technique that he is using, and he gets an audience that really appreciates his creations, his art, and not just, oh well, this entertained the masses, or here's the latest derivative retelling of whatever thing has already been told a million times before. That someone trying to do something new can find an audience that will genuinely engage with it. And that is a role and relationship between these two characters that is very interesting. But at the end of the day, the artists are not being valued because they're just being eaten. They're viewed as useless. They're less use than the horses and the mule. The fans devour their own hero, their own artist, where we see Nifty Gum being literally eaten by his fans, where he had tried to devour and live off his fans, where there was that whole circle of influence between them, where he had a chorus of these fans who could not critique his work. We then have the chanters who are just entertain me, and that's funny, I like that, that's fine, that's good. All of these different levels of different interactions about how we all individually approach literature. We all approach it in different ways. There are different things that we like. There are different things that we appreciate. It is all part of this ecosystem of artist and author and critic and reader, that we're all part of it. And we're all an essential part of it, because without an audience, an artist is howling into nowhere. Without art, there is no audience, there's nothing to view. So it's all part of this thing. And I thought that was so wonderfully played with, looking at all of the different angles. It's not just a cynical, authors are unappreciated. It was actually an honest appraisal of, there are multifaceted layers and complexities to this entire system that is going on, where everyone feels unvalued and unlistened to in some respect, and valued and listened to when viewed from a different position.
Beautiful.
There's a great scene where one of them even says, look, what are you talking about? A story needs mountain passes and danger and a hero with friends, and these friends need to get in trouble so that the hero can save them. They have these fixed formulas that it has to be this, it has to be that. And on the point of the complexity of the portrayal of the artist itself, I just remember that even look at what the artists do to AP when they think they still have a chance to get AP's approval. I mean, they're ready to be AP slaves. It's only, even Brash, it's only once he realizes that AP is no longer going to be saving him. It's only once he realizes that it's not going to work out the way he wants, that he starts going into his sort of big tirade about how unfair the system is and blah, blah, blah. So the artists themselves are more than happy to suck up to the critic when they feel that the critic will give them a positive review. It's only once that flips that all these sort of proclamations of injustice come in.
And hang on, I would like to object. The character is called Apto, and any resemblance between Apto and myself is entirely coincidental.
That's funny, because I was picturing
it's
you.
AP, guys. You know that. I mean, we're in spoiler section, guys. Whoever's watching this, you've read it, and we're on AP's channel. You know what I mean? That is AP. Come on.
I was picturing him the whole time and hearing him both. Yeah, pretty much. So, but it's interesting because this isn't at all actually just noble artist and unappreciative audience at all. The artists come in for some really good lampooning as well. You have characters like, what's his name? Rude, the old fellow, Calip Rude, right? Who has plagiarized his story. Can you imagine that? Someone in a creative realm plagiarizing. Oh my goodness. And of course, his is the story that it's the only story he has completely memorized. So the poor guy has to just sort of spout it out. And he isn't able to finish though, because of Flicker's manipulations, but Flicker finishes the tale. And it turns out to be a pretty bad choice of a tale because of the theme it introduces of cannibalism. But this isn't, obviously, it's not just about audiences cannibalizing their artists. You've got everybody pretty much gets their turn at being mocked in this story. So it's really great. And at the same time, they feed off of each other. We need each other as well. So Ruthan,
but Philip, was that a bad choice or a good choice? Because for all we know, Calip Rude's actual story might have just been the nephew, Toblakai, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There might have been a happy ending to that story. For all we know, it was Flicker who picked up on that and manipulated it into a plot twist of inviting the enemy being around you all the time in order to create that sense of paranoia. One of my favorite quotes about Calip Rude was even where he steals it from, and Erikson's like, he steals it from all these different places, and also from upstarts who are foolish enough to say things in his presence, because sometimes upstarts themselves are dumb enough to say these really clever things in the presence of senior whatever in their profession. I mean, I'm sure it's happened to all of us, and then we find it just plagiarized and lifted by this by this old guy, and he gets all the credit for it.
Yep.
And one of the interesting things is, obviously, yes, we have the characters are cannibalizing the artists, but we see clearly the artists are cannibalizing, metaphorically, other artists, because they're they are lifting stories from other, it's retellings. Here is Anomandarus by Fisher, the lullaby version. So we have artists cannibalizing themselves. And of course, this is all in a book written by someone cannibalizing the Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
The layers and playfulness with all of this, like, this is so wonderfully done, and it is done with a sense of humor. It's not done, it is never mean-spirited. And something like this could have so easily drifted into that. But this is actually just having fun with it.
Totally. It reminds me again of Chaucer, because here you have this narrative voice that is so self-mocking, and it is, even as Chaucer makes fun of every single other character in there with these very specific observations, they're just beautifully targeted to have the reader imagine in their mind, oh, okay, so the the prioress is up to something that she shouldn't be doing, just based on these little clues, here and there. Or the cook is great because he makes this great stuff, but he has this terrible pus oozing wound on his shin, and oh, it's a shame because he made such good custard, so it gives us these little tiny observations in there, but he also is self-mocking. Chaucer has inserted himself as the narrator into the Canterbury Tales, and he makes fun of himself just as much as everyone else, and his own insecurities, his own place as an artist. This comes through in all of his work. How he thinks it comes through in The House of Fame by Chaucer. It comes through in Parliament of Fowls, his other lesser known works as well. He's constantly thinking about his place as an artist, his relationship to his audience, how will people read his work in the future, these kinds of things. And you can see all of this in Crackpot Trail as well, the self-mockery and everything else. It's really fantastic. So we all get our turn at being dunked in here. Absolutely.
So actually, before we go on, because we've been on this for a little while, and I'm conscious of the fact that we do have another story to talk about, and time is getting on. Do you want to wrap this one up here? Do you think we've discussed enough, or are there any other points that we haven't touched on that you'd like to?
Can I just quickly touch on the 1001 Nights thing? I need to do my non-Western thing. So the easy comparison is, of course, the idea of stories being used to stay alive, because Arabian Nights, written in the golden age of Islam, is all about a girl narrating the story to her husband, the king, in order to not be executed the next day. So that's easy. But the other real juicy bit for me was the whole idea of stories within stories. So in 1001 Nights, you often get these. So one easy example is, we all know it's a story of a girl sort of saying stories to a king. And in that, there's a story about a guy who goes to a moneylender. The moneylender refuses to give him money unless he tells him a story. So that story is about a boy who's captured by a genie. The genie says, I'm not going to let you go. And the boy says, oh, genie, let me tell you a story and let me go. So there's a story within a story. And even here, it's a story, as you said. And then the whole Casa Kilava thing, the Toblakai Aimas thing. So it's a story within a story, and then the Toblakai starts narrating a story within that story, and inside that there's a story about the uncle raping his mother. So once again, there are many layers there, where it's almost like an Inception type never-ending cycle. That part, as a fan of 1001 Nights. Since Chaucer gets got a lot of love in this video as well, we might as well give the Arab some love as well. I would say that from my perspective, this really drew so many parallels with that. And as a fan of 1001 Nights, and 1001 Nights has cannibalism and pedophilia and bestiality, it's got a lot of messed up shit as well, very much like Crackpot Trail. So that was my sort of Arabian Nights comparison.
Well, and interestingly, about that, the Toblakai story, the Tibler story, think of how that ends in Crackpot Trail, with the subversion of the expected ending, and it's the surprise ending, and it's a villain, and it ends in an unexpected death. And then relay that back to what actually happens in Crackpot Trail, that all the way through, and as you had pointed out, like Flicker keeps giving us these hints about what's going on, even in this story that is being told, where there is the expectation of what's going to happen, and no, expectations are subverted when we see this time and time again. And looking back at it with a reread, you go, how did I not spot this? So that was a lot of fun. But Philip, sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, I was just going to add to what Ruthan Bad was saying, in that, in a way, Crackpot Trail more resembles 1001 Nights than Canterbury Tales, because you have this tension in the frame narrative itself, or you have this tension in the main story, where in 1001 Nights, we are in suspense because we want Scheherazade to live. We want her not to be executed. And we have a similar kind of tension here with the storytelling going on in Crackpot Trail, because they are telling stories to stay alive. So yeah, I love that you brought that in there, Ruthan Bad. So thank you for that. Yeah, so I don't know, we didn't talk a lot about the hypocrisy of the paladin type characters in here as well. You have the Arpo, Relent, and you have, of course, what's his name, the White Knight,
Talgod Weiss.
Thank you, Talgod Weiss. These guys, the one huntsman guy is a little bit different, I guess, in a sense. He seems to be a little more honest with himself. He's the one who admits to feeling some guilt, which is something that most people in the party are not openly admitting. So that moment when what's his name,
Maynard Steck or something like that.
Yeah, Steck Maynard or so, whatever his name is.
Whatever, yeah.
So he admits his guilt for this. I mean, there is a tendency for people to sort of look the other way, or to delude themselves, or to tell themselves this is not happening even when it's happening. So it's interesting though with the paladin, the two paladin characters, how brutally unaware they are of their own hypocrisy, and how they paint themselves constantly as these righteous figures who are, their horses are more important than the other members of their party. So in a way, they're the tyrants here within this story, and they are maybe the most morally bankrupt of all, you could say, even as they pose as the upholders of civilization. And so the heroes, those who are clothed as heroes, are sometimes actually the ones who are most responsible for the brutality all around us. So
Arpo versus Apto is one of the best moments of Eriksonian humor, where sort of the critic's natural sliminess and a sort of intellectual slipperiness sort of magically translates into physical slipperiness and physical agility as well. That is Eriksonian humor. Come on.
Where Apto slides out of the way and Arpo Relent slams into the boulder. And with the resulting, I guess, not even, I mean, he's gone, basically. He's possessed later on by the indifferent god. And the indifferent god, where are they all going? They're going to the indifferent god. How, I mean, for all these poor poets to be going to this city to be judged where there's this shrine to the indifferent god. I mean, that's a statement in itself, isn't it?
And then not only that, the reason the god it was the indifferent god was that he wasn't there.
Yeah.
So
what are we after here?
I get there is so you can read this book so many times. I just think it's absolutely fantastic. But thank you both so much for making this as painless as possible. So Ruthan Bad, thank you so much for coming on to discuss this with me. I really appreciate it. And before you say goodbye or anything, while everyone is here and watching this, if you are not subscribed to Ruthan's second channel, 7 Minute Lectures, please go and have a look at his channel, 7 Minute Lectures. They are phenomenal, short, brilliant pieces of analysis, posing questions, making us think about complex topics as well as fun topics. And only 7 minutes long. You can fit them in. They are really brilliant. I cannot endorse them enough. Absolutely fantastic. So Ruthan, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, AP. You are Malastube's mortal sword. Maybe you're Erikson's mortal sword and you're Malastube's first sword. How about that? So it's always great to be here to discuss these things with you. Big honor to be on your channel, as always. Thank you.
And Dr. Fantasy himself, Dr. Philip Chase. Thank you, Philip. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, AP. It was great talking with you and the High Fist, both. You guys are fantastic. And I'd also like to thank Steven Erikson for writing a story with Apto Canavalian in it. So.
And so thank you very much for watching. And if I don't die of embarrassment, I'll see you in the next video.